Okay, folks, Chapter 8 talks about children as victims. Okay, so we can look at this from a couple different positions. We can look at it from a maximalist or a minimalist position. And those are pretty much what they, exactly what they sound like. So a maximalist position says that it's really maximizing the problem. They're saying that children as victims is a really overlooked problem reaching epidemic proportions. They're saying that it's a problem that doesn't get enough attention, the government isn't intervening often enough, and we must mobilize people to combat this growing crisis. So as you might expect, the minimalist position is saying that they're skeptical of just how broad of a problem this is and just how serious it is, and feels that it gets some attention and some financial expenditures that are not really warranted. So these are both ideologies, okay? And individuals of these categories might be considered someone who's an alarmist or someone who's a skeptic. And in reality, neither side really has data to support their position. And children as victims is probably somewhere in the middle. So let's think about missing children, first of all. So first of all, when we think about kidnapping, what makes something a kidnapping is what's called asportation, okay? And that's the moving of somebody from one place to another. And the courts have held that this doesn't need to be a very far distance at all. There have been cases where, a man grabs a woman in her car in the driveway, backs out of the driveway, has an accident, and that was considered transporting the victim far enough to be kidnapping. Kidnapping doesn't always involve force or violence in order to be illegal. Most children who are quote-unquote abducted or missing are actually missing. It's pretty rare to get kidnapped by a stranger. Generally, most of these cases are custodial issues. So sometimes people can manage to detain somebody through trickery or manipulation, and we call this availment. Okay, this could be done via kidnapping. It could be done for a ransom or robbery, to abuse the child. Sometimes we've seen people steal a child to raise them as their own, or unfortunately, sometimes in order to kill the child. So we don't have a lot of real data on quote-unquote kidnapping. It's not a Part 1 crime under the UCR, so therefore we don't have a lot of information about it. The NCVS does not ask about kidnappings, and we also know it doesn't include crimes against children under the age of 12. So what are some explanations? I think the thing that most people think about when they think about a kidnapping is they think about a stranger abducting a child, okay? But other missing children include runaways, kids who will eventually return home. Another phrase you might not have heard of called a throwaway. And these are kids that have been basically kicked out of their homes. It could be somebody who's abducted by a parent after a separation or a divorce. And sometimes a child is missing because they're confused and lost. In 1984, there was a national incident study of missing, abducted, runaway, and throwaway children. And the idea here was to try to actually gather some data. And they found that there's let's say around 100 life-threatening kidnappings per year. There's about 12,000 short-term abductions by non-family members, and about 56,000 long-term abductions by family members every year. So you can see that overwhelmingly here, these are incidents they're generally custody incidents. So this study, so that's the first NISMART study. The second one looks at 800,000 cases reported to the police. Just about half were runaways or throwaways. About 43% were misunderstandings and miscommunications between the child and parent, and 8% did not return home due to being lost or being injured. So what are some ways we respond to this? Well, I might put out a BOLO, a be on the lookout. We can also activate an Amber Alert, although there are specific requirements for an Amber Alert. There needs to be information that can actually be, I'm sure you've all seen an Amber Alert. Either it's woken you up on your phone in the middle of the night, or you've seen one on highway, those light up signs on the highway. So there needs to be specific information in order to issue an Amber Alert. We've also seen Code Adam, right? So when somebody realizes a child is missing in a store, they often call it Code Adam, right? And so they start to look for the child. They try to prevent people from leaving the store. We've also heard some other things we hear about is stranger danger, right? And that's the piece that I think kids are taught a lot about victimization, even though the people most likely to harm them are people they already know. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea of secret word from your family. So one of these kidnapping ruses might be, oh, your mom, I'm a friend of your mom's and she had me come get you. So when I was a kid, I can remember families talking about this or people talking about it. That like there would be a family secret word that if someone was really coming to get you, your mom or your dad would have told the person that secret word. So here's some accomplishments of the Amber Alert system, and there have been kids who have been recovered as a result of this. So we can see the number of alerts per year, the number of recoveries as a result of those. So, in 2005, there's 275 alerts with 220 recoveries. 49 resulted directly from the alert. In 15 cases, the child was recovered too late, so the child had died. So you can see that these alerts do seem to make a difference. Okay, we also have issues for children as far as victimization goes in terms of physical and sexual abuse and, of course, neglect as well. So battered child syndrome is a cycle, a pattern of excessive punishments perpetrated by parents who themselves may have been abused, not definitely were abused. Neglect is when we fail to provide basic requirements. So as a parent, there's specific things you have to require for your child under the law, for their physical needs, emotional needs, educational needs. And if you fail to do that, Department of Children and Family Services could come into your life as a result of neglect. Physical abuse ranges from physical force to extended confinement. And sexual abuse includes, that's obviously a term that encompasses a lot more. Everything from incest to fondling to sodomy to intercourse, rape, and exploitation. So in terms of child abuse, a national incident study found that 1 out of 58 children experiences quote-unquote harmful maltreatment. 58% were hurt physically, about 24% were sexually abused, and about 27% experienced some type of emotional abuse. So the maximalist position says this is occurring in enormous numbers and it's often not reported. The underreporting is this very serious problem. This position would also say that those who are in positions to see that children are being abused or neglected, so professionals, teachers, counselors, are not reporting. And that cases that are reported are not followed up on due to lack of resources. The minimalist position would say, the definition of child abuse has been expanded, that slapping a child or spanking a child are included, and abuse now includes normal discipline. They're also talking about that events are not increasing, but reporting is increasing. And there is some evidence that reporting has increased, although that really increased in the 70s and 80s as people became more aware and were more educated about child abuse and domestic violence. They also feel that unfounded reports should not be counted and that the media has really sensationalized occurrences of child abuse. So in the 70s to the 90s, we did see an increase in events, but as I mentioned, some of this is also due to greater awareness of this behavior and therefore greater reporting. That increase then ebbed in the late 90s and has been decreasing. So we've got a rate of 15.3 in 1993 to 9.2 in around 2011. So that's, nearly a 40% decrease. We also know that drugs and alcohol are factors that contribute to child abuse as well. Okay, there's also concerns about, a wide variety of issues related to this. So one issue is, when sexual allegations come up in a divorce. So a couple is divorcing, they have parents, my goodness, they have children, and one person alleges that the other parent has abused the child. There's also this period of time where they talked about repressed memories of children, and a lot of these memories turned out to be false and turned out to be a result of people, performing hypnotherapy and asking really suggestive questions. So there's a whole series of books you can read from like the 90s where people came forward and wrote these stories about how they had been really horribly abused, but they had repressed most of those memories. We also know we've had problems with sexual abuse by clerics. In particular, this was a big problem in the Roman Catholic Church. And then in the 90s, there was this period where people were talking about satanic cults and something called satanic ritual abuse, which was the idea that there were these satanic cults and they're abusing people and they're killing babies in the name of worshiping Satan. But there have been 0 instances of this. But this was a big thing in the 90s where people were really coming forward saying they had expertise in this. So what are some things that can happen in terms of legal proceedings? Okay, so a lot of times what happens to a child as they go through the system, so if DCF has come out to the home, the children will be assigned or appointed a GAL, a guardian ad litem, okay? And that's a person whose job in the system it is to look out for the best interest of the child. Okay, GALs are volunteers. This is something that if it interests you, you can actually be screened and volunteer for. There's been a couple responses to abusers. So one response is to think of the behavior by the parent as dysfunctional and in need of treatment and rehabilitation, whereas the opposite sort of extreme of that is to think of them as criminals deserving of incapacitation and punishment. Another thing to think about when we deal with these cases is that when children are victims, that means they're also witnesses. And, what are some of the issues that might arise with a child testifying? So people, there's one point of view that says children are generally competent witnesses when it comes to fairly recent events. There's other views that question the trustworthiness of a child's testimony that is vulnerable to coaching by adults. And it is true that high pressure techniques can really lead to false memories and ultimately lead to a wrongful conviction. So it's really important for a judge to assess. And usually what a judge is going to assess in terms of a child being a witness or being able to testify is their capacity for understanding about telling the truth. So there's been some court cases around this. One is Wheeler versus U.S. from 1895, and it said that any child under 14 that was going to testify had to first pass a competency test. The Child Abuse Act of 1990 said all children are competent to testify unless you can provide evidence to the contrary. So basically, children are assumed competent. You would have to show that they are not competent to testify. In 1990, there's also a U.S. Supreme Court ruling, Maryland v. Craig, that ruled that there are alternatives to direct confrontation. So this could be things like use of dolls in testifying, exceptions to the hearsay rule, that there are some modifications that can happen when children are testifying. I believe in the Maryland v. Craig case, the children were able to sit in a way where they weren't directly viewed by the defendant. Okay, so when we think about the criminal justice system, we know that it really works like a funnel, right? So we have a lot of cases at the beginning that come to the attention of the police, but as they get weeded out at various stages. So by the time we get to the end where someone is convicted and punished, and even when they are, of course, punished by being sent to prison, very few cases remain there, okay? So we can have sort of these proactive strategies or reactive strategies. So some things in order to kind of address this include screening potential child care workers, setting up helplines, support groups for abusers, child rearing courses, and then, of course, there's safe haven laws. And these are aimed to prevent infanticides. So Massachusetts has a really hokey kind of commercial for these where a bunch of people rap about the baby safe haven law. So this is the law that, allows you to drop a child, usually a newborn child, to bring them to a police department, a fire department, or a hospital. And the idea here is to prevent a parent from killing the child. There's other things that happen too. Siblings might be abusing each other. Sometimes kids in the home are abusing parents. And then we also have issues related to statutory rape. So statutory rape happens to be my area of expertise. And statutory rape involves someone who's over the age of consent having sex with someone who's under the age of consent. So the law in each state sets an age of consent. And people below that age are deemed incapable of consenting to sex. So if they are engaging in sex, it is automatically considered a sexual offense. Okay, and that wraps up chapter 8.